Sports build champions and leaders, but every champion has moments of struggle, pressure, anxiety, burnout, and those moments deserve real support. PAX Health is proud to sponsor the New Jersey Lacrosse Podcast because they believe mental health care should be available when you need it, as you need it. Therapy and psychiatric services for kids, teens, communities, and families. Telehealth and in-person appointments are available within 48 hours. PAX Health, people helping people. Visit pax.health. That's PAX.health. Lacrosse families, meet Orgo, the calendar app that actually thinks like a sports parent. Orgo syncs with team apps you already use and enriches schedules with real-world logistics. Every event shows travel times, early arrival buffers, carpool assignments, conflict alerts, and time-specific weather so you know what gear to pack. Get your athletes on it too. Orgo teaches time literacy, an executive skill for life. One subscription, whole family. Code LAX25 is 25% off. Just $44 locks in sanity for the whole year. Visit www.orgohq.com. That's www.orgohq.com. JAG Physical Therapy, providing rehabilitative recovery from sports and soft tissue injuries to knee, foot, ankle, hip, shoulder, elbow, and back injuries. Schedule your appointment with JAG Physical Therapy today and meet their experienced team of physical therapists, occupational therapists, athletic trainers, and exercise physiologists invested in your full recovery. Get back the life you love at JAG Physical Therapy, the most awarded physical therapy provider in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. For more information or to make an appointment, just visit jagpt.com. That's jagpt.com. This is the New Jersey Lacrosse Podcast. I'm your host, Keith Glock.
I'm Bill Farr.
I'm Anthony Terranova.
And this here is Gil Swenson. Welcome to the New Jersey Lacrosse Podcast. All right. Ready?
I'm going to be looking at you.
Yeah, we can. Yeah. We just be normal, whatever you want to do. Okay.
Hold on, let me get rid of this.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this edition of the Overtime. Well, we're going to start that over. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Overtime edition of the New Jersey Lacrosse Podcast. I am Keith Glock. I am joined here in my lovely home. Thank you for coming over on Palm Sunday by one of the assistant coaches at Lawrenceville, but certainly somebody who is no stranger to the New Jersey lacrosse scene, public, private, and otherwise, Rob Siris.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, excited to be here, please. Thank you. No jokes. Obviously, we've known each other a long time, going back to when you were at Hopewell. But I want to take everybody back in the Wayback Machine and go back even past that. And played at Drew, grad school, coached at MKA.
Yeah.
And before we even get past that, you were a part of a situation at MKA that I think is like tragic.
Yeah.
And insane from a logistical standpoint. Noel Clank, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this stuff, head coach, first day of the season, passes away.
Yeah, so Noel was, when I was at Drew, Noel was always around, and the lacrosse community in the mid-'90s was a lot smaller. So, guys like, Coach Kirst and Noel Clank were figures up in North Jersey where I grew up, and I had an opportunity right out of college to coach at Montclair Kimberly, and he was a great friend, a great role model. And then my second year at MKA, he tragically passed away. I believe it was April 1st. It was we had a game that day, and he passed away. And it was a tragedy for the lacrosse community, a tragedy for his family, and it was definitely something that, as a second-year assistant coach, and I'm still in my early 20s, how do you navigate that? And we were very fortunate that we had an alum that was kind of a volunteer coach, Paul Edwards, who was an All-American at Johns Hopkins, and he had just retired from Lehman Brothers in New York City. So, having him as a father figure, which you need when you have a tragedy like that, and it's just such a blessing that Noel Clank, you have the Clank division today, and he was somebody that really was a fixture for New Jersey lacrosse for so many years. So it was pretty pretty remarkable experience. And I just learned so much from him. I think for a lot of coaches, sometimes you're lucky where you have a Tim Flynn or somebody like that you can learn from. And Noel Clank was one of those people.
And then Paul obviously ended up staying at MKA for forever until very recently.
Yeah, and it was a great story where I think it was 2013 when I was at Hopewell. We went up there and we played MKA, and they had a great team. Matt Lane was, obviously he's a great coach today, but he was an All-American beast of an attackman, and we had a great game, actually an overtime loss to MKA in 2013, I believe, which was pretty cool to go back up there and coach against them. And coincidentally, at the Lawrenceville varsity B team, we played Montclair Kimberly this past May in the prep. I believe it was a prep semifinals, and it was so awesome because Noel Clank's grandson was on the MKA team, and I believe he's a sophomore this year.
That's wild how all this stuff comes full circle.
The New Jersey lacrosse community is small, but I mean, literally every week I meet somebody that there's somehow a connection to somewhere.
I couldn't agree more. I can't turn around seemingly without somebody being like, "Hey, you do the So from there, obviously, in your coaching lineage, then you get a job at Hopewell Valley as a teacher and immediately take over as the head coach there. And in my opinion, I think one of the reasons we ended up connecting, was you were always asking the questions of the officials of like, take me through this rule. And I always thought it was because you were really trying to see how you could maximize the rules to give your team an advantage. And whereas other coaches just like yap about rules and questions, and you seemingly were different. Yeah,
I think one of the things I love about being at Lawrenceville right now is the coaching staff and the players. We have a really fanatical viewpoint of understanding the rules well, not so you can manipulate them, but so you can play the fairest way possible, but maximize your potential with the rules. And it's been a long time. I think a lot of the people that maybe know Keith today know him as a top Division I official, but I also remember you coming in and being a first-year referee, and we kind of started the same time period, and over the past 20-plus years, it's been amazing to see the growth of the sport, and it's been pretty cool watching your growth personally.
Well, I mean, I feel similarly about you, and as the years went on at Hopewell, and then the opportunity at Mercer County Community College when they added the program, I thought you were the perfect choice to start that program, and I think now that you're there 5 years and now you've been away from that for a couple of years, I think that the benefit of time, and this is not a knock on anybody that's been there since, but I mean, you recruited the heck out of what you could, and that team was playing at a level that was up here, I think, comparatively. What was that like, founding a program and being kind of told, here's the keys and make us relevant nationally? Because I know that's what the messaging was.
No, I think there's a lot of newer people to lacrosse in New Jersey that are not really familiar with junior college lacrosse. If you go to Long Island, or if you go to upstate New York, or you go to Baltimore, people there, everybody knows about junior college. I was just watching the Yale game yesterday, the great upset against Cornell, and I don't think a lot of people know that Andy Shea, the Yale coach, started out as a junior college coach, and one of his players was John Grant Jr., and then the two of them go to Delaware, and John Grant Jr. is one of the best players of all time, and Andy Shea is a national championship coach at Yale. What I found really interesting was I'd always heard of Onondaga. I'd always heard of Nassau. Growing up, it's interesting, there was also Morris County Community College had a team. But, for a lot of people, if you're not financially, I think that's kind of really the big one. A lot of people are not financially capable of going right to a four-year college, and lacrosse is a more expensive sport. There's a high cost of entry. So that was something that was really interesting to me, and this goes back probably about 15 years ago. There was a meeting at Mercer. It was myself, legendary Virginia goalie Chris Sanderson, and Bill Tierney, who was the coach of Princeton. And there was a question about how do we go about building something in Mercer. And I didn't hear anything for about 7 or 8 years. And then, I heard about it, and John Simone, the legendary Mercer County AD, we connected. And, I think if you know Mercer County, they have one of the best soccer teams in the nation at any level. Their baseball team is phenomenal. And, it was an interesting proposal on how do we build something from nothing at Mercer. And it was an amazing process.
How difficult was it in that process of building it and figuring out where to recruit, how to recruit, and then actually executing that with, what I thought was a great coaching staff, with Surface and Sergetti and those guys. You just talk about a group of personable guys that know the game and certainly guys that you trusted through the years.
My first year at Mercer, there was a full season where it was just recruiting. And I literally reached out to every person I knew, every coach in the state, whether it was Del Barton or Westfield or Lawrenceville. So I started with New Jersey at first, and a lot of people said, you're not going to really find somebody. And then I got a goalie from Lawrenceville, and I got an attackman from Westfield. And so we had... I think there's a lot of underlooked reasons to go to a community college. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's academic. Sometimes people just want to stay closer to home. So, that first year was, it was really a pleasure for me. I was able to visit every Mercer County high school and go to every one of their practices. So I learned a lot just by seeing, what other schools' practices look like. I spent a lot of time with the Princeton University coaching staff that season. I was at, every high school game. Was my first time really able to watch high school lacrosse because I'd been coaching or playing, since the mid-'90s. So it was really interesting. And then the lacrosse community in New Jersey is pretty vast. So I had a former player of mine, PJ Martin, who coached with me at Hopewell. He was, one of the top players when Petty was a top 3 team in the nation. And he runs True Lacrosse out in Utah. So, I was flying out to Utah. I was able to recruit kids from Colorado and Washington State. We had kids from Idaho. We had kids from California, New York, so Florida. And, there's a lot of people that are maybe unfamiliar with how much lacrosse there is out there. And there's not a ton of opportunities at the college level. I mean, the growth of the game at the college level has not been at the same level as the high school level. And it's very, very difficult to play college lacrosse. So the demand and the supply was something that really came about.
That you were able to do that nationally was pretty awesome. And I mean, honestly, I think that we are spoiled, right, in New Jersey. But so you're saying Idaho and Utah, and the vastness of just the sheer number of college teams that are even local to where we're sitting right now here, in central New Jersey is it's wild comparatively, to the rest of the country. So there is motivation for that kid from Idaho or Florida or, wherever to come north and say, I want to keep playing.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about the New Jersey lacrosse community is it's small. You should never, ever, ever, ever burn bridges. Sometimes recruits will burn a bridge with a coach, and that first year when I was just recruiting, I spent time at every college in New Jersey. And, I remember speaking with Coach Brecht and the Princeton coaches. And, my first year at Mercer, we scrimmaged Drew and Stockton and FDU and all the D2s like Georgian Court. And one of my big things that I did recruiting-wise was reaching out to NJIT and all the other Division I, Division II, Division III schools in New Jersey. And when somebody maybe had an academic issue, or maybe there was a financial issue, or maybe it just wasn't the right fit with playing time, we had Division I, Division II, and Division III kids that started out at a school like NJIT or some other schools like that. And, we would try to get somebody maybe bouncing back. And then at the same time, they would want to scrimmage us because we would have guys that would transfer to Montclair. So, Matt Posque was great contact. For me, it was pretty awesome being a Drew alum and then having two former Mercer guys eventually become captains at Drew. And I just got a text from Dan Lytle, the Drew coach, this morning about recruiting. So I think for young people who may be listening to this, the more connections you can make, sometimes it might not work out at Rutgers, but maybe it works out at Drew. And, you have somebody that goes to Drew, like their face-off guy that just transferred from Drew to Rutgers, and, there's a lot of options. But I think for people to not understand that junior college can be a great option. I remember talking to Coach Brecht about their All-American goalie, Max Edelman, who started out at CBC Essex in Baltimore and then transferred and became a All-American at Rutgers. So, I think there's a lot of options throughout New Jersey. So
yeah, no doubt about it. And now, obviously, you landed at Lawrenceville, and you have, this vast experience of both public and private.
Yeah.
And kind of being through this all, playing lacrosse in the 90s all the way up through coaching it now, we're getting up there in age. And what have you seen like in that transition, right, between the 90s and now, and then publics and privates?
If all you know is high school lacrosse in New Jersey today, things have changed dramatically. There was about maybe 60 or 70 teams in the mid-90s. Today, there's 200 plus. You have schools like Kingsway, which didn't have lacrosse. You have Mercer County. You have schools like Robbinsville, which didn't have a high school.
Right.
And things ebb and flow. And what was once the traditional group of Ridgewood and Hunter and Central and teams move. The rules change. I think, for a lot of people, playing in the mid-90s and early 2000s where, I was a goalie, so you had 10 seconds to get it out of the box, right, the defensive box.
And then you could stay there and zone forever.
And then after that, it was unlimited time from the top of the box to midfield. And then you had 10 seconds to get into the box, and there's always a count. And the worst thing, there was a horn anytime the ball went out of bounds on the end line or the sideline, which was, I still have nightmares sometimes of hearing the horn while I sleep. So, that was pretty bad. Here's a good rule I'd love to have come back. If you were on man down and then, you made a save and then you got the ball up the field and you got the ball into the offensive box, right? You could pump it in and, you can get your guy back on the field. I really think that would be a fun thing to add. And I'd be curious from you if there's talk about that, because
we kicked it around.
Yeah.
I although the health and safety of the players is the number one thing, right? So in a situation where you have a disparate skill level between the one team and the other team, where it might be a little easier to dispossess the ball and get the ball down the field, you could almost be incentivized to foul, which might be against the health and safety regulations thing. But I agree, in its most pure form, if nobody ever abused the rule.
Now, things were different because the stick technology was radically different. The ball was on the ground so much more. One of the reasons why I went to Drew was they were like the first school to have turf. And as a goalie, I thought this was the coolest thing ever, that there is AstroTurf. Now the stick technology is so much better that the ball and stick skills are so much better that the ball just, for better teams, just does not hit the turf that much more. So, it's been a really interesting seeing the evolution and seeing how many more teams. And, I have a vivid memory in the mid-90s of the first time, my old friend Ross Turco and Tri-State Lacrosse. It was the first club ever. And, then, and I know you have a connection to this, but watching the New Jersey Pride play in the MLL, whether they were at Yogi Berra Stadium in Montclair State or, the 90s in New Jersey, I think was a fundamental part where you had the success of Princeton and, Jesse Hubbard and Hess and Massey. And then from there, it just really started to blow up in the late 90s. Then, today, New Jersey lacrosse is some of the best in the nation, as we've seen just with scores yesterday of,
Summit and Radnor.
Summit and Radnor and Bosco and Lawrenceville. And, it's been pretty interesting to see kind of the public schools. And I went to West Essex, so it's a public school, but I also did a post-grad year at Trinity Pauling. So I see the value of the private school. I coach at Montclair Kimberly private school, and we had a great rivalry with Montclair High School. I actually used to coach ice hockey at Montclair, so it was a great rivalry between the public and private. I love, and I've been to so many Morris County championships where for years it was just Mountain Lakes and Del Barton. Coaching at Hopewell for 14 years, I love the hashtag Stay Public, and I know Hopewell still has that today. And, it's been really interesting kind of seeing, I think it's a healthy rivalry. I think the public schools have always worked well. I mean, Mountain Lakes is a perfect example. Summit and Jim Davidson, who coached at Drew previously, and I've always admired how, he has formulated this zone defense that has been able to beat, teams like Del Barton. And, there've been, obviously I wish we can go back to the TOC because, some of my best memories are, sitting with my former Drew coach, Tom Lianos, who his son was at Del Barton, and, watching the Mountain Lakes Del Barton finals or the Summit Del Barton finals, or when Bridgewater did great and I think went undefeated, and Ridge, Moorestown. I mean, there's so many really good public schools, and that legacy is awesome. At the same time, it's been interesting seeing, what CBA has been able to do. What St. Augustine was just up at halftime against Episcopal Academy, which is, one of the top teams in the nation. So there's a lot of great lacrosse, and there's reasons why some people might go to a public school, and there's reasons why somebody might go to a private school. But I think it's a healthy relationship. And not all states have that, because there are some states where the public schools, or the private schools are really very different. Summit could beat anybody, and and they've always been like that. And Bridgewater and Pingree just had a 1-goal game yesterday in overtime. So we're taping this on the 29th, I believe it is. So
that healthy public-private rivalry, in the year where the TOC was dissolved, and this was my argument, and the inside of that, for people who don't know, obviously the Cursed Cup still exists.
Yeah.
It's a little different, obviously, than what the TOC was. Maybe not as, since the state kind of got uninvolved from it, it just feels a little different. But that year, the last one was the two smallest public groups playing each other for the state championship. So, whereas in basketball and football, the argument is, we can't have the TOC final anymore because there's just such an imbalance of power between the publics and privates. And we were kind of standing up shouting from the mountaintops going, look, our smallest public schools are the two best teams in the state this year. Like, this is not true for us. We don't want you to do this. But there was, uniformity won the day, which we obviously disliked. But it is unique.
Yeah, there's a lot of nostalgia. I mean, I have a great memory of being at Rutgers. It was on the grass field, TOC. It was Del Barton versus Summit, and the crowd was huge. I remember the governor, I think it was Governor Corzine at the time. He was a Summit guy, and he's there. I'm sitting next to my coach, Tom Lianos, and next to him is Scott Stevens from the Devils, whose son was on the Del Barton team. And you just have this enormous crowd and so many people there. And whether it's Del Barton or Summit or Mountain Lakes or Bridgewater, the lacrosse community is really, really tight. And, it's just, there's so much great history. And, I've had a lot of people, I'm a history teacher, and a lot of people have said, oh, hey, Rob, have you thought about writing a book about the history of New Jersey lacrosse? And, there's a lot of pieces, whether it's from, Tim Flynn, who's just such a legendary person, Chuck Rubling from Del Barton, and there's so much history that I think it's important to share and learn from. whether it's like those Montclair teams in the 80s and 90s, or how good Rutgers was in the 90s as well. And then, Princeton emerges, and Bill Tierney, comes from, kind of comes and becomes the savior of New Jersey lacrosse and what he was able to do. And today, the ability to go to a Princeton game and see, literally hundreds and hundreds of lacrosse kids, it's pretty cool, and,
It is.
and I really want everybody in the lacrosse community to make sure that you're getting out there and watching more games, and being a part of it, because, once you get that, I mean, it's one thing when you see clips on Instagram. It's another thing when you're able to sit in the pouring rain at Drew and watch Del Barton and Chatham play. And, Chatham is one of these, it's a small school, but, Chatham almost beat Del Barton last year, and Chatham right now is having a fantastic season.
Yeah. Well, certainly one of the best offenses, if not the best offense.
Yeah, I'd probably
in
say,
the state.
yeah, at least public school.
For sure. And they would argue probably doesn't matter public or private.
No.
They'll make that argument. It's funny you said about the TOC when it was played at Ursac at Rutgers. That was the first TOC final I ever officiated.
Yeah.
It was Summit Bridgewater. Summit on that 60-something game winning streak,
Yeah.
and then Bridgewater and Scott Bita, and those guys and win, and then they go on their own, 60 game winning streak.
Yeah.
And I was talking with Bita about it. He's now back, obviously, as the offensive coordinator at Rutgers, and that atmosphere was unlike anything I've ever been a part of. 6,000 people, at that field, and a 1-goal game couldn't have got any better, and that was the last one that they ever played there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, but so I want to talk about Lawrenceville a little bit, because I think what you're doing at Lawrenceville, along with John Posner and Tucker Mazier, is you're building a juggernaut.
Yeah.
You have built a juggernaut there. And a loss to Episcopal Academy aside, I mean, most places had you guys as the number 1 team in the country.
Yeah. We just beat the number 2 team, Malvern, yesterday. 11-7 was a fantastic game. And, I think sometimes people, they think of a boarding school and they think, okay, well, they just recruit good players and that's it. I think what's important to understand is the amount of work that goes into being Seton Hall Prep or being Summit or being Lawrenceville. And, there's obviously an establishment, because, Lawrenceville used to be in the Pitt division and, would play Summit and Del Barton, all those teams. So there is that history, but, the ability to, I think for all programs, sometimes people wonder, hey, well, what's the secret? It's an insane amount of time working on rides and clears. It's an insane amount of time watching film. It's an insane amount of time shooting. And, public schools have the ability to do that. And we've seen examples of this with Chatham, where they, I love driving up to Chatham and, you see goals in kids' backyards, and it's pretty easy to go on Facebook Marketplace and, Craigslist and get a rebounder and a goal. So, I mean, there really shouldn't be any barrier for that, or to find a wall somewhere. But I think it's important to understand how much time goes into it. And, when a school, whether it's a boarding school or a Catholic school or a public school, when people come together, and you can really do amazing things. But, every day for us is the Super Bowl, because teams want to beat us. And, there's a lot of work that goes into it. And that's just something I love, for somebody that loves lacrosse. And I know there's a lot of people in New Jersey that are lacrosse people. Those top teams, it's just work that goes. I think that's the separator, the amount of work that goes into it in the off season, lifting, film work, the amount of film work and scouting reports that's important. And, I learned this when I was recruiting at Mercer. I'd go watch a team practice, and I didn't think they knew who they were playing next. And that's not good, right? So if you don't know your enemy, and this is, goes back to the book, The Art of War. If you don't know your enemy, you're going to be, or respect your enemy, you're going to be in trouble. And, I know, when I've talked to a lot of officials, the officials go in saying, hey, you know what, we know maybe the history between Rutgers and Princeton, or we know the players, we know, some things that are going on, because that's going to be a big difference in terms of officiating that game. And I've talked to you about that a lot. And understanding and really respecting your opponent, whether it's a scrimmage or a regular season game, there's a lot of homework that goes involved, and I think that's the separator.
And I think it's one of the things that is part of the evolution of the game, right? Part of the evolution of 2026. There's information is there.
So much
now.
information.
Yeah, like you used to have to search. Like if you said to me, like as a player in the '90s, like go find, like if there was like some game on some, you were like, oh my God, put a tape in the VCR. Let me try to get this. And now like so much stuff is just kind of at your fingertips. But to your point, some people are willing to put the time in to utilize it.
There's so much more information, and I have this vivid memory. John Keaton, who was a goalie from Montclair, All-American goalie at Rutgers, and I didn't know how to string a goalie stick because you just didn't have the information. And I remember I saw a Rutgers lacrosse poster at Rutgers, and I remember grabbing it and just stringing my stick based on how he strung it. And now, if you want to string a stick, and sometimes it's the wizard, sometimes it's the wand, but if your wand is not strung well, you're not going to play well. So today there's so much information, and I think for a young player, you can go back and just search for Summit games or Bridgewater games and just watch games. I think every player has the ability, and I know every player's on their phone, and I teach at Hopewell, so I see the Hopewell guys there all the time. I think watching clips is interesting, right? And I'm on Instagram and I watch clips, and I think that's interesting. Jersey Sports Zone is fantastic. However, the ability to watch 1/4 of a random game every single day for 15 minutes, you're on your phone, watch 15 minutes, and there's just so much on YouTube that you could watch, and the ability to say, hey, well, what does Summit do with their zone? And it took me probably about 15 years to really study that Summit zone. And, I think once you see it, it's like light bulb goes off and you're like, okay, now I understand what they do on the crease with their zone. And I don't want to share what they do with their zone because but it's legendary. It's legendary. And I'm sure, their win over Radnor, and Radnor, as of yesterday, was the best public school in the country. Not anymore, because Summit and their zone is formidable. And, some teams use zone, some teams use other things, but to watch a quarter, I would say to people listening to this, find some Del Barton film of Ned Crotty playing, or Joe Sanowski with Mount Lakes, or Michael Springer, who played at Ridgewood and was a legendary player at Syracuse. Watch some of those video clips, and it would be pretty fantastic.
Didn't realize my alarm was going to go off in this as we try to keep ourselves on time here, Coach. Hang on. Sorry about that. Give me your top one or two things that if I said to you, like over the course of your coaching career, that you're like, oh, this was like my number one memory of something.
I would say for me, my number one memory, I'll say coaching at Hopewell. My number one memory was, I always feel like it is critically important to play the best competition possible. Lawrenceville, we play the best schedule in the nation, and every game is a juggernaut. And, there's some teams out there, and I know the previous podcast, you've talked about some teams that don't really travel up to North Jersey or travel some other places. Early on in my Hopewell career, Kinnelon up in Morris County was a top 10 team, and it was our first win against a team of that magnitude. It was a 4-3 win, right? I really wanted to kind of play like Summit played, and this was possessing the ball. And, when you're able to do that and go up to North Jersey, or maybe a North Jersey team going down to South Jersey and playing St. Augustine, those wins are incredible. And even the losses, losses against, for me as a Hopewell coach, losing to Chatham, or losing to St. Augustine, or losing to Pingree, or losing to Bridgewater when they went undefeated. Those close losses build character, and, it's going to help you in May and June. But even if you don't win that last game, you learn a lot about adversity. And, I really value teams that play the best they can play. Because win or lose, you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to see high-level lacrosse. And today, there's some really, really high-level lacrosse in New Jersey, and there's still some lacrosse that's not very high level. But I think people should know the difference between the two, because stats are sometimes all over the place. And, a funny story, I remember, sitting at an All-American meeting at Pingree years ago, and Matt Poske, who's the all-time leading scorer in New Jersey, some coaches thought, maybe Matt is not an All-American caliber because he played at A.L. Johnson. But his stats were real, and he was that good. And when he won a championship at Virginia, and he was Major League Lacrosse midfielder of the year, Matt Poske is one of the best players to come ever out of New Jersey. And he didn't come from, he was from Johnson, and it wasn't, Westfield or Summit or one of these other schools. But, it's been fantastic seeing, a school like Kingsway, which is not a traditional school. They're pretty good. And, it's been interesting watching players really emerge and develop. Another great thing for me is watching this past year, Luke Caldwell, who, is one of the all-time leading scorers in New Jersey, an All-American. He's lighting things up for Washington and Lee. But I remember him when he was 5 years old on the Hopewell sideline and a student of the game. And, I remember last year people thinking, okay, well, maybe his stats are inflated. And, leading his team in college and scoring right now as a freshman, his stats were not inflated. Poske's stats aren't inflated. Like, there's a lot of really good players that are just that good. And, maybe they're not at the top high school, but it's, I just love the underdog story. And there's a lot of really cool underdog stories in lacrosse in New Jersey.
One last one before we let you go. I obviously respect the heck out of you as a human being. And I think kind of your career arc, there's something to be said about the fact that you went from being an assistant in high school to being a head coach in high school to being a head coach in college, and not like shown the door, making a decision on your own to change and say, you know what, I want to do something different, and go what I think most people would perceive to be a step backwards, where I am fairly confident in saying that you don't perceive it that way.
No.
But I want to just have you share with everybody the mentality that it takes, because you were the head man for a couple of decades in places, and now you take on a not head coaching job. And what has that been like for you, and how does that all kind of work mentally, and what advice would you have for people that are going through?
I think humility is one of the more important qualities. I didn't have that as a young coach, and I think I have more of it now. But I've learned so much in the past few years at Lawrenceville. John Posner, who is one of the best coaches ever, and what he did at Culver and what he's been able to do at Lawrenceville. I've learned so much about what it takes in practice. I've learned so much about how important riding is. Riding is the essence of Lawrenceville lacrosse. And clearing, I thought for 20 years, I was like, okay, you do clearing, maybe 20 minutes here, 20 minutes there. The amount of time you need to work on clearing is insane. And if you're not working every day on riding and clearing, you're not going to be exceptional. So there's nuances of offense that I've learned at Lawrenceville that is just mind-blowing. And then once it's like, there's this special sauce that once you learn the recipe and you learn the ingredients, and there's things that, like I said earlier, once I kind of figured out what Summit was doing, it's incredible. And even though we don't run any zone at Lawrenceville, our zone offense is pretty fantastic. And it takes a lot of work to understand how to navigate a zone offense, a zone defense, how to run a 10-man ride, which we do exclusively, and then how to break a 10-man ride, which a lot of teams try to do a 10-man ride against us. So I think for everybody being humble, I'm so grateful with the, being a Mercer County guy. The Princeton coaches have been fantastic because, once a year I'm able to, I go to a ton of Princeton games, but, for someone listening, call up your local high school coach and see if you can just watch a practice. There's so many amazing Division 1, 2, and 3 coaches, and the ability to call up Mickey Hover at Georgian Court and see what he does there at practice, and Dan Lytle at Drew, or the Princeton coaches, the ability for me to sit down and figure out, okay, well, how do you best utilize your best player? How do you utilize your worst player? I think for everybody, you have to keep learning. And I think once you stop, you're going to be stagnant. There's a reason why Summit is so good. Coach Davidson, I love that man. He's done such an amazing job, and he's always learning and always trying to find new things. And Coach Flynn has done such an amazing job at Mountain Lakes. And sometimes people make excuses. They say, "Oh, the school is small, or we don't have a feeder program." Don't make excuses, right? Just keep learning, keep grinding, and keep studying. And what I love about New Jersey is the coaches are so receptive if you have questions. And as a young coach, you're kind of like, okay, can I ask this coach? Can I borrow film, or can I spend time at a practice? But for a young coach maybe listening to this, call up one of the local coaches. I was so thankful, Shelly Shiner when he was at Kane, of just kind of seeing what he does there. And, some coaches, it's their full-time jobs. Some college coaches, it's their part-time job. So how do they manage being a teacher and then also coaching? There's just so much you can learn from other people.
No doubt about it.
Yeah.
One of the mainstays of New Jersey high school lacrosse over the last 2.5 decades. That makes us sound real old. But Rob Siris, thank you so much for sitting down on the Overtime Podcast, the New Jersey Lacrosse Podcast, and wish you guys the best of luck as the season goes on.
Thank you.
Go ahead and bring home another national championship.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll be back with our usual episode on Monday, dropping in your podcast feed wherever you get it. Thanks, everybody, for watching.